60% of whether we internalize our emotions or externalize is actually genetically based. So set in us before we are even born. You are who you are, but that is both the source of your strength and your limitations, and you can grow and you can do something about it. If you are an introvert now, that's not going to fundamentally change. However, you can learn simple routines, simple adaptations to that.
Those early experiences of the first few years is impacting as basic things as just what we focus on.
Amazing. All right, and we're live. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Shlomo, Nik. Welcome to the Recruitment Show. I've been really excited about this, and we've kind of like almost had a pre-podcast before we even recorded, which was interesting. So anyway, maybe we'll bring some of that in. Just give you both a little intro. So great to have Professor Shlomo Ben-Hur from IMD Business School, and Nik Kinley, seasoned coach and psychologist, and I believe ex-group head of learning from Barclays. They've both just penned a new book together called Rewriting Your Leadership Code. So uncovering how our past experiences shape our leadership abilities. So really interested to discuss with you both and how we can unravel our childhood experiences, early education, personal history, and how that influences our leadership style and so forth. So thank you both very much for joining.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Pleasure.
Thank
so
you.
Nik, are you in London? Or?
Yeah, so I'm about 30 miles southwest of London, which means I've got a traditional English summer's day of misery and grey.
Nice.
Which is
Snap.
Yeah.
I'm in London. Yeah. Same. And Shlomo, you're in Switzerland, I believe.
I'm in Switzerland, very much in the center of the Swiss Romand, which is the French part of Switzerland on the shores of Lake Geneva. And Nik hates hearing this because we have been talking every day this week. I mean, and I keep saying that it's sunny and beautiful here. So it continues to be sunny and beautiful today too.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Let's dive in. I've been really interested to speak to you both. And maybe to start, just in terms of our brain development early on, so childhood, how do you think and how does that influence our leadership as we get older into adult life?
a lot.
Big question to start with. Go on,
Full
Nik.
stop. I was actually studying. I was looking at a bit of research last night, and there's a whole bunch of research that shows as we go into more senior roles, as we accrue more power and control, that there is a closer relationship between what we bring, so our inner qualities, our inner traits, our inner personality, and how we actually end up behaving. And, I mean, if you think about it, that's quite intuitive, right? So when you're in a relatively junior role, you can't go around always being yourself. You have to go around and adapt yourself to your stakeholders and do what your boss wants and, put on this nice poised professional thing. But as we grow into more senior roles and we develop into more senior roles, the evidence shows that people reveal themselves, that they become themselves more. And so for us, part of the question is, so what is it that they're bringing, right? So if you're bringing more of yourself, the higher up the tree you go. If we're seeing more of you, if it's revealing more of your inner preferences, inner traits, what are you bringing and where does that come from? And the answer to that inexorably goes back to childhood, because that is when our earliest sensitivities, and when I say sensitivities, I mean tendencies to pay attention to certain things, to feel anxious about certain things, angry about other things, and the things that trigger us in the environment. That's when that is first laid down within us, as is our most basic ways of responding. And
then when you say early, you say is this like 0 to?
Yeah. So
7,
when we started off this research, I was probably expecting 7 to mid-teens might be the most important years, but actually the evidence is pretty clear that it's in the first 5, 6, 7 years, and that even more than that, for quite a number of core characteristics, it is the first 2 to 3 years.
Really? Wow.
It is that early. So if you take a characteristic, for example, such as self-regulation, our ability to regulate our emotions. And we distinguish here between some people who are internalizers, and they're the people you don't want to play poker with because they never show their emotions and you can't really tell what they're thinking, right? And then there's externalizers who, I mean, you just know, right? They can't keep it to themselves. It shows on their face. It shows just, and you can tell exactly what they're thinking and feeling. Now, there is very strong evidence that actually about somewhere between 50 to 70%, and the average most people come out with is about 60% of whether we internalize our emotions or externalize is actually genetically based. So set in us before we are even born. And then the other 40-odd% is determined within the first few years, certainly within the first 2 years. And that is all driven by our environment. And for example, whether we have an environment that leads us, that's quite soothing, or we have an environment that actually evokes quite a lot of emotions in us. And the reason why those first years are so influential is because that is when the basic pathways within your brain are being formed. The neurological pathways within your brain are being formed. And once they are formed and once they are set, they're set. And we can learn new things. We can learn new ways of behaving, but those core original ones, and in the book, we kind of pull out 4 or 5 really important kind of pathways that kind of affect us throughout our lives, but most especially within leadership roles. And they're set really early.
Interesting. So do you not think... Go on, Shlomo, sorry, go on.
I mean, it's interesting that while Nik was studying further research last night, I was actually catching up on the Democratic Convention. I mean, and watching all of these speeches by the different Democratic speakers. And the fascinating thing was that when trying to promote Kamala Harris, everybody was talking about her childhood. They were talking about her mother. They were talking about her father. They were talking about the emotional inheritance she brought with her. Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, Emhoff. I mean, everybody was just speaking about those early childhood experiences, what she would wake up to, what she will do when she sees her mother doing this or her father doing that. So intuitively, people realize how important that is. But what we have found, I mean, is that it's so backed up, I mean, in the research, I mean, in the studies that were done, I mean, about those brain connections that get established, I mean, in such an early age.
Do you think then, just based on this, all of this leadership training, exec coaching, etc., how much of an impact does that then have on someone's leadership? Or are you basically saying, do you know what? I mean, you are who you are.
So I think we're saying both. So I think a large part of the book, I mean, we kind of joked that I had this idea that I wanted to call the book "We're Screwed," because you are how you are, right? And the publisher didn't quite like that. They thought it wouldn't sell quite so well. But there is a strong element.
Like that, do they? People feel like, well, hold on a second, I can.
Well, and it's a core thing, right? I mean, people come back to us and they say, but it's just how I am. It's just the way I'm wired. And there is a large degree of that for us, right? If you are an introvert now, if you're someone who likes your own company, you're not someone who goes out and seeks company at every step, that's not going to fundamentally change. So very definitely you are how you are. However, you can learn simple routines, simple adaptations to that. So you can learn simple ways to make yourself feel more comfortable with networking. You can be systematic in how you approach it and have a little routine that you always follow. And that is where I think the power of leadership development and coaching comes in. That certainly when dealing on this personal behavioral level.
Yeah, but okay, and then stuff like like work ethic, ability to communicate, emotion intelligence, things like that. They're either partly you're born with it, and then that early, say 0 to 5, whatever, 6 years.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back to the Democratic Convention last night, right? There will be people who, or this week, there will be people on that stage, and I'm sure we can all guess who they are, and they come to mind quickly, who look just natural, right? They are absolute naturals. They have this comfort up there. But there are also people who are not naturals, but who have nonetheless learned some of, some really good communication skills. So it is that both and. I think we are enabled and encumbered by what we bring with us, by some of our core traits, our core tendencies, our core abilities, but we can still learn, we can still grow on top of it. And that's the key thing, right? That we can learn. You are who you are, but that is both the source of your strength and your limitations, and you can grow and you can do something about it.
My biggest fear with this book was that people would go all the way to saying there's nothing we could do about it. This is who we are. This is our makeup. This is where my issue with authentic leadership has been, throughout the years, where people thought that authentic leadership meaning just being yourself, being who you are. And it was my colleagues from London Business School, Goffey and Jones, who said that you need to be yourself, but with skill. And I think that's partially also our argument here. You want to be yourself, you want to get to know yourself, because this is the biggest mystery of our life. Is actually understanding who we are, but do it with skill, really refining that with all the coaching, with the work, with the learning, with the experiences that you actually reflect on.
Love that. Are there certain, so just following on from this then, we can talk about development as well later on, but are there certain childhood experiences that predispose you to certain leadership traits? And then maybe just to give context to that, obviously, but to give context is you often see some of the most successful folks having some crazy backstory, they've gone through difficulty early on in life. And is that, I've always thought that, I've never seen evidence for that. It's just, anecdotally, hearing people's stories and stuff. But have you seen a link now?
Yeah, and I think what we wanted to try to do in this book that was different was that we didn't just want to write a book that said childhood is important, full stop, right? Because it's like, what's new in that? So what we've tried to do, and that's why I look so grey these days, and Shlomo's, sorry. This is where it happened, because we went through over 1,200 academic papers. And we scoured them to try and draw a very clear link between specific experiences and specific tendencies within leaders, specific leadership behaviors. And that there is enough research out there to draw those links. But I think what's new about what we've done is that we've actually we've drawn them out very specifically. So we haven't just said childhood's important, honest governor. We've tried to say, actually, for example, if you're having a look at self-esteem, these are the very important things to have a look. These are the influences. These are the situations that are most likely to have an impact. And in terms of specifically what you've just mentioned, which is effectively drive, right? So you're quite right. A lot of people who get to the top and are more ambitious and more driven, they tend to come, when you meet someone who's very ambitious, very driven, that tends to come from something having been missing or hard or difficult in their youth. Because let's face it, if you grow up in an environment that is entirely comfortable, shoes up, let me bring you another lemonade. There is no impetus. There's nothing to push you forwards to really form that drive, to create that work ethic. Whereas what you often hear, one of the stories we hear most often, so one of the questions I'll ask if I'm assessing people is, how are you similar or dissimilar to your parents? And if you meet someone who's got a really strong work ethic, almost inevitably, you will find one of the parents was like that, right? And they'll go, oh yeah, I got that from my father who said this, or I got this from my mother because, wow, she did 17 jobs and kept the house together and was always organized. So yeah, there is very definitely, there are certain experiences that lead through to certain.
Sometimes though, on that, you do see the kids of really successful folks don't do as well as their parents.
Well, yeah, because then there's a question
That's
of
the comforts
is there? I mean, what you often see there is a sense of entitlement. And although we won't necessarily, there is now a whole new field of literature and research that is coming out, having a look at the impact of the Chinese one-child policy on the personality traits of the leaders who are emerging from that generation, and because there is very good evidence that when parents have just one child, they treat them differently than if I met a gentleman a month ago who broke my record. Who he came from a family with 16 other siblings. That's the most I've ever come across. But
yes.
I'm guessing his experience was different than
Massively
if you
different.
grow up with just, as a single child, right?
Yeah,
and
that's so interesting because I've been speaking to some. I've got 3 kids. I was speaking to some parents, and my oldest kids kind of at the stages like of when do you give them a phone, right? So that's number one. We can maybe just talk about that. Secondly, when I was growing up, my mum was like, be home before the sun comes down, essentially, and we had a bit of adventure and responsibility from quite a young age, right? Whereas now, I think certainly in London, you see, and this is coming from a good place, so I'm not knocking parents here. But you see a lot of overprotective parents coming from a good place, but not letting their kids have as much, arguably, right, as much adventure and as much responsibility as perhaps we did. So I'd be interesting to see how that might affect, if you agree or not to that, and also this effect of smartphones and when and how that will affect people and their leadership and their experiences and stuff. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Shlomo will have a view on smartphones, but if I kind of start off on the other bit first, I like you grew up in an environment where I was told, "Don't you dare come back dead," and that was about it, right? You were kicked out the front door, and and if you do come back dead, make sure you've got a good excuse. It was that was kind of it, right? It is very different, and certainly in my youth, and I'm 56 now. I can't remember anyone ever being driven to school. You walked, you cycled, right? There was this pouring of children out into the streets who would walk to the house, and it's very different today. So that will, I am sure, have an effect on people as they grow up. Are people growing up with a lesser sense of independence? I don't know, but that would be one of my guesses there. I think. But we will see differences. We will see generational differences between it. And I think the smartphone one, we're still waiting to find out what that's going to be. There is very strong evidence that the use of smartphones, the use of technology changes how people think. So, for example, just one example, the younger generation are more able to multitask because they're more used to, having a conversation whilst looking at their phone and doing something else and watching YouTube at the same time. And if it's my son, I'm sure he's got about 17 screens on all at once, right? But so we know that there are going to be changes in how people think. Whether what there's been a lot of debate about is how it will affect people's quality of relationships and ability to relate to each other. And I'm sure Shlomo's got a view on it, but my personal view is that at the moment, I think that debate is primarily being driven by values and assumptions and older people looking on thinking it's different and assuming, therefore, that it's going to be bad. And actually, I don't think we have sufficient research yet to truly say what the impact will be. But inevitably, it will be nuanced. Some good things, some bad things. Shlomo, what do you think?
I think that we could probably venture to a whole hour of just talking about the influence of technology and sort of like what it does to human relations and to how kids growing up. But what is fascinating for me in the research that we've done, that we tried to compile in this book, is that those early experiences of the first few years and even the birth experience and all of that is impacting as basic things as just what we focus on in terms of like what we see and what we don't see in the environment in front of us. I mean, this is so much more primal and early than even sort of like all of the stuff that we've just started talking about. For me, that was fascinating. That means I see or I hear things differently because of the household that I grew up in, because of whether my parents were arguing or loving, I mean, in the household where I was sort of like born into, whether I had a difficult, my mother had a difficult delivery or not. I mean, these things have impacted what it is that I see at the moment when I'm just looking at the two of you on the screen versus what Nik is seeing, what I pick up versus what other people are picking up. And when it comes to leadership, that is such a crucial thing that most of the developmental programs that I've been involved in, and I've been in this business for decades of my life, have not really focused on, in terms of like, what cues do you zero in on versus not?
Interesting. So you think actually smartphones, less of an effect than how you grow up and those experiences early on?
Yeah, the emotional environment, without doubt. So I mean, if you think about, to follow on from what Shlomo's been saying, for example, whether we are more sensitive to risk or reward. So do we kind of play to win, or do we play not to lose? And it's that, you know, what does our mind go to? You know, are you pessimistic? Are you optimistic? Good example here, because Shlomo is a great optimist and I'm the other. And it's you know, the world is going to end, and it's going to end horribly, and it'll probably do it fairly soon. And what kind of drives that? So we know, for example, that if you have parents who are anxious and pessimistic, you are more likely to be anxious and pessimistic yourself. We know that if you have parents who are very encouraging, you're more likely to be sensitive to reward and more optimistic. We know that if you grow up in an environment in which there was lots of punishment, so there were lots of rules and strictness and punishment, you're more likely to be sensitive to risk, as you would be, right? Because if you've got very strict and punishing parents, you're going to be thinking, well, you know, you're going to be careful to avoid it. We know that but it's not just how your parents treat you; it goes even broader than that. If you grow up with parents who argue a lot, so if you grow up in an environment in which there's tension, and obviously if there's tension between parents, the kids tend to feel anxiety, then you grow up sensitive, more likely to be sensitive to risk than a reward. So it's even this very general emotional environment around you. It's not even just how people behave towards you. These can you know, and if you think about sensitivity to risk and reward, how optimistic or pessimistic you are, for leaders, as Shlomo said, that is fundamental, right?
Yeah.
Because one of your jobs is to make decisions, and it's one of your biggest jobs is to make decisions. And if what you're even focusing on, and if and there's plenty of studies done that you can provide a set of data, and the optimistic reward focused Shlomo there is going to go, well, I think there's a good opportunity here and we should consider it, and let's do some due diligence. And I'm just going to look at it and shake my head and go, you're kidding, right? You know, there's death and pain that way.
Question on good kids and bad kids. Is there any predictor, maybe one for you, Shlomo, as you're smiling here, any predictor of leadership traits for kids that are like really naughty early on or really good?
So we used to think, I mean, before writing this, that good kids that grew up, I mean, in good household and were sort of like the good students, the good followers of their parents, the ones who did not rebel, were going to be the good leaders, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who kind of like come with that assumption. They did well in school, they were good kids at home, they will do well. What we find is being a good kid sometimes does not necessarily mean that you're going to be a good leader. That actually being the good kid could actually stand in the way of you daring to make courageous decisions, not drowning yourself with the noise of other people trying to please them, but actually having the courage to go against the stream. I mean, and actually make some critical decisions there. Nik, I'm sure you could say a few more words about this, right?
You know, it's interesting. Also, just let me just jump in a little, because it's interesting, and this is anecdotal, but I mean, I speak to like thousands and thousands and thousands of folks through the exec search work I do. And it's interesting because what you find is, and I see this a lot, it's people that have done really well in school, they found it really easy, and they do well, and then they do well at GCSEs, A-levels. If you're in the UK, you go to university, do well, maybe you get onto one of those top graduate things, and then suddenly in the workforce, it's not, you know, it's difficult. You know, just because you got the straight A's doesn't mean you're going to get the promotion. Suddenly other things matter to get to those leadership roles. your human skills, your ability to network, interact. You know, you hear it all the time. I spoke to someone the other day. It's like, how did that person get the promotion? I'm way better than them. Maybe, technically, but you're probably not a better leader, and you certainly weren't invited into the interview process. And it's like, well, why not? And then you start to look at that. So I do find a lot of folks, and I'm generalizing a little here, but you know, that find it easy early on, sometimes struggle to get in. Because also the other thing is that early on in life, it's all about I, right? Like, I do well at my studies because I've worked hard and I've done well, stuff. And then suddenly, you know, to my leadership roles, it moves from I to we, right? So suddenly your success as a leader is dependent on your ability to get your team performing. And that's a big shift, big mental shift. Do you think that, I mean, I'm assuming you say yes here, but is there a big indicator of that ability to shift from early experiences?
So certainly there are. So what you've talked about there is the fact that the game changes, right? That actually what's going to make us successful at school is not the same as what's going to make us successful in our first job. Which and you know, that the further along we go, it adds a new layer of challenge. And
to your analogy on poker, it's like the blinds going up and readjusting.
And to speak to the example you gave of, you know, you've met lots of people who've said, but I'm way better, you know, and in terms of, we've all met people like that who in terms of core skills are incredibly skilled, but you know what, maybe they don't network enough. Maybe their self-presentation isn't particularly great. You know, maybe they don't exude confidence, so people don't necessarily have confidence in them. Maybe they're just not good politically enough, right? Maybe they're not good enough at making themselves liked, because, you know, and so they don't even make the long list or the short list, right? They're just, so all of those things are, it's an entirely different game the further up the tree you go. Now, there has been quite a bit of debate, therefore, about, are the most successful people the most adaptable? There has been quite a bit of debate, therefore, about whether the ability to adapt is one of the core things that you ought to be looking for. You know, sometimes what we call agility or that kind of thing. And there are good childhood predictors of that. However, what the research shows is that there is actually what's called a curvilinear relationship. So imagine an upside down U, right? That when you don't have any adaptability, that's bad, right? Because you're just going to carry on being yourself in all situations. You don't adapt, that's not going to end happily. Because if you shift circumstances, then sooner or later, you're going to end up in a role where what you're doing doesn't work. If you shift a bit and you've got some ability to adapt, that's really good, because you need to do some things differently in different roles, and you need to learn new skills. But if you do it too much, you can end up as a bit of a chameleon, or as a bit of someone who, I mean, one of the common things we'd find here is that people struggle to push. They aren't seen as assertive enough, or they're not seen as having their own agenda that they're then able to push through a bit of resistance. And so by being almost too adaptive, they're too attentive to what the environment wants from them. And that's not really consistent with what you want from a strong from, you know, or from any leader, you know. That so which again is almost brings us back to that bit of, you need this, and I don't like the authenticity word because I think it's used poorly in lots of circumstances, but you need a core you, and then you need to understand what that is and how to play to those strengths. And then you need to be able to add on bits here, learn a little trick that gets you through that situation there. And it's
but also, I mean, other people might be like, do you know what? I don't want all of you, some of you, you know, or to maybe to your, you know, your Democratic Party thing, you know, maybe it's like, I don't want your political you. I want this you. So don't bring all of yourself to work, just some of yourself to work.
Well, there's always a degree of performance at work. I mean, one of the lines that we use is that when we talk about openness and how difficult openness is to actually drive at work, is that the only if you ever meet someone who's open about everything, truly transparent, truly authentic, open about absolutely everything, then you can pretty much guarantee that they are single, unemployed, and friendless. Because, you know, I mean, yeah.
I
Do I
think
look
that
okay?
what we find frightening is how little people actually know about who they are, who they truly are, how
Yeah.
seldom they actually take the time to reflect and engage in that. You know, I mean, one of the honors that I have as a professor at IMD is that we're so close to the mountains here, and the last 15 years, I mean, I've been taking probably hundreds, if not thousands, of executives to the mountains to engage in these reflective walks. I mean, we go to the mountains, we go to the Alps, I mean, and we spend time in the snow or in the summer. And people have the opportunity to shut off, to turn all of the noise off and try to get closer to who they are, to what their life journey has all been about. And it's quite amazing to see the major aha experiences, or just the excitement that they walk away with for just having time to think through this and to discuss it with some other people. I mean, we might be like spending our life digging into this, but what is disheartening is to see how little time executives actually take to think about how they go about decision making. How do they deal with authority? What signals do they tend to pick from the environment, and how those relate to sort of like all of those assets and liabilities that they carry with them?
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. I mean,
I actually think it's even more. Sorry, Lewis. I actually think it's even more toxic than that, Shlomo. Because I actually think the environment that we work in often actually makes it even more difficult for us to connect with that. So, on earlier this week, I was coaching a gentleman who, on the surface, is super confident. Just, you know, I mean, he's slick, right? Quite impressive. I'm really impressed. But when we dug into it, actually, he's got these little telltale tiny signs of anxiety. So he sent me like a dozen emails before we met because he wanted to make sure he'd done everything right. And, you know, he's slightly reactive. If you give him a bit of praise, he smiles. If you give him a bit of, you know, if you say something negative feedback, he gets a bit defensive. And what we looked at is that when you have a look, so on the surface, his surface self-esteem is very strong. But beneath that, what they call his intrinsic self-esteem, his inner feelings of himself, are not so strong. And actually, they're quite weak because he grew up in an environment where he had an incredibly critical father who was always criticizing him, never praise him, never hug him. It was always, you know, if he did something, it was, you know, great. So you got a 10 out of 10. So you should, right? And it was just like, you know, that's it, you know, and a 9 is, well, what happened to the other one? So it's, and that was a very tough environment. And so he grew up with, you know, a very low kind of inner self-esteem. And what the research shows, and the way the research pulls these apart, is that if you wire people up to a machine and you look at their stress response, their anxiety responses, so physiological responses, how much cortisol is running in the blood, their heart rate, that sort of thing. And then you put them through certain situations. They do not, even if they say, my self-esteem, my confidence is 10 out of 10. If they've had those childhood experiences, their heart rate's still increasing as if they had very low confidence. Their cortisol is spiking. Their stress hormones are spiking as if they had. And they can be completely unaware of this. And this gentleman that I met on Monday was completely unaware that actually that's what was going on in him. And I think what makes it difficult for leaders is that we're told, you know, we need to be confident, right? But we need to be confident, right? We need to be sure. We have to be strong. You know, I've never come across a leadership framework that says the weak leader. You know, there's the charismatic leader, the confident leader, the transformational leader. Never come across the slightly unsure leader, right? I've never seen a leadership framework for that. And yet, that's what's going on in it. But he was completely unaware of it. But it was still affecting his behavior. And that's what's really powerful about some of the research that we've kind of done and pulled out, is that we're looking at not just what people know, but how their childhood experiences can affect them without them ever even realizing it.
Crazy. I've got a couple of questions. I would say 3 questions. Love you to do some research on the nice guy does win. Nice, kind leaders, I think, win. there's this caricature, like tough, leader, shows, can't show emotion. And I think, that's always been the caricature. I think people now, they want to work with people that are there for them and things like that. So anyway, that's just a slight side point. Two things. So self-esteem, both on self-esteem. So parents, we have a big responsibility. I mean, it's almost like, just summarizing everything you've described. As a parent, like, it's on you. So maybe some actionable things that parents can do, and I'm one of them, that can help us build up our kids' self-esteem, because I think it's probably the biggest gift that you can give your kid, is to build up their self-esteem. And then just kind of moving on from that, if you're a leader and you've just had a coaching session with Nik and you've realized that, my God, I need to rebuild my self-esteem, can you, and how would you go about doing it?
So this might get to sound like touchy-feely, right? But I would start with love, right? I mean, so one of the best things that you could do to help your children build self-esteem is simply love them. I mean, so like, just be there for them, see them, make sure that they feel that they're being seen. But at the same time, I would say that what we're seeing, and that's a lot of research, I mean, and research that has been looking at sort of like more modern parenting versus sort of like the more traditional parenting of previous generations, is that kids that grew up with parents who want to be their friends, their buddies, are actually much more confused going into this world. I mean, in terms of their self-esteem. And that as a parent, you also want to make sure that you're giving boundaries to your children, that there's clarity around who the parent is and who the child is. But that within this relationship, within these parameters, within these boundaries, there is a fair amount of affection that happens. I mean, we see that people who actually were hugged by their parents come to the world with a very different disposition than people who got the cold shoulder, or even were supported by their parents but never had that tactile exchange with them. Yeah. So I think that we're really talking about like creating a frame, making sure that you remain the parent in this relationship, but making sure that as the first step to building the confidence of your child, you convey love, you make sure that they're being seen, that you listen to them. Nik, you probably have plenty more to add to that.
Well, no, I mean, just in terms of to help, I mean, absolute, just yes is the only thing to follow up with. But also, I think to help people think about it, there are 5 dimensions that we pulled out in our research that are real in terms of how parents behave that can really affect the development of self-esteem. The first is, as Shlomo said, open affection versus more distant affection. And there, it only goes in one direction. High levels of expressed affection from parents consistently associated with people feeling more positive about themselves later in life. Full stop, end of story. Having said end of story, there are some cultural differences in that. So how affectionate we see our parents as is partly judged by what the norm is in the environment that we're growing up in, right? So I'm guessing that for an American child, what is seen as open affection is very different as for a Japanese child. The second dimension is how accepting or demanding your parents are. And there, really, for parents, you need to aim for the middle spot, right? Because you want to be, on the one hand, it's important that children feel accepted for who they are and what they like. So not dismissing your child when they say, I like something that you look at and you think, well, that's stupid. But actually showing some curiosity about it. But at the same time, I think also there is a degree of being a bit demanding of pushing children, not just leaving them in a comfort zone and actually exposing them to new things. But that's how accepting or demanding. So the third one then is praise and criticism. And again, this is a middle road, but so in general, if you grow up with critical parents, you're more likely to have lower self-esteem. But if your parents are just accepting of Shlomo, you're just wonderful, right? Constantly. It doesn't matter what you do, Shlomo, you are wonderful. That can actually leave you with very brittle self-esteem. So in general, an emphasis on praise, but not always. And The fourth thing is then how strict or permissive. And that's where I think Shlomo was speaking to, the parents need to put boundaries. But what's really important there, the research shows, is not which boundaries you choose to set, which rules you stick by, but how consistent you are in them. And it's so when parents are inconsistent in forcing rules, that can significantly undermine children's self-esteem. And it's because they're unsure about where they are. Well, have I done right? Have I done wrong? So they become unsure about that. And very finally, it's about autonomy and control. How much freedom do you have as a child? And again, generally speaking, those children who grow up with more freedom, grow up with higher self-esteem, except in the extreme cases. If you've got neglectful parents, then that you end up feeling neglected, right? That you're not worthy of attention. But those are the five dimensions.
No, thanks for that. Appreciate that. And then can you work on rebuilding? So later on, you're doing your leadership development. Nik's the coach, whatever, like you've explored the childhood and you've got these things. Are there things that one can do to rebuild or improve on, develop, or is that it? Like you're set?
So the evidence fairly strongly shows that our intrinsic self-esteem, once it is set, our inner self-esteem, once it's set in those very early years, 3, 5, 7 years, whatever it is, it's set. So once those pathways are in you, they are there. Our external self-esteem, actually what we say we feel and how confident we feel in the moment, so not what's physiologically, biologically happening within our bodies, but actually how we feel in the moment, that's incredibly variable, and that you can work on, that you can do something. And that's where there's lots of simple techniques like positive self-talk, right? Actually, positive self-talk works. If you say positive things to yourself, you're more likely to feel positive about yourself. But that's working on extrinsic self-esteem, not the inner stuff. So what you can do is you can help build your extrinsic self-esteem, which helps build your ability to manage your emotions in the moment. And then the second thing you can do is just become really aware of actually, so with this gentleman that I was coaching the other day who's got very low inner self-esteem, it's about helping him understand more how that is affecting his behavior, how other people see it. It never occurred to him that in the email exchanges we had before the coaching session that I was going to think, before I even met him, I thought, gosh, he's an anxious one, right? And he was really surprised when I told him that. But
so if you have some awareness, so if you're self-aware,
then you can do something about it, right? You're better able to manage it. And really for us, that was why we wrote the book, because we know that there are things going on within people and within leaders that we're not aware of in the moment, right? We're focused on what's just gone wrong, the problem that needs to be solved, the crisis that's happening. We're not thinking about what's happening inside of us, even if we are more deeply aware of it, but they can affect us. And so we wanted to help people be more aware of it so that they can manage it better.
I love that. I talk a lot about working on, difference between working in your business and on your business. And I think also I view yourself as you're the CEO of your life, your career. And I know it's important to work on yourself. Is my point. And I think it's wonderful. It's good to be, people don't do it as often as they should. Just taking a step out of all of the stuff that's going on and just exploring these things. I think it's really powerful because, absolutely. I think you can do certain things. You can dial up, dial down, positive self-talk, whatever it might be. And it's interesting because I talk a lot about the importance, integrating your work and your life and, keeping your energy and your battery and all of those things full. And I think some of these things go some way in doing that.
And it brings us back to the Democratic Convention. And it takes us also back to the conversation we were having before this, to the 16th century, because it was Machiavelli, right, who said that power will be productive of good or ill effects according to those upon whom it is, as to whether those on whom it is conferred are good or evil, right? And the idea being that the effect that giving someone power will depend upon what they bring into that situation, upon who they are, upon what that inner self is, upon what. And I think we only have to look around at the political leaders to us today, and I think that is pretty clear, right? That how they use the office, ignore policies, how they use the office is tells us an awful lot about what they are as a person beneath that. Absolutely. And it's going to be interesting to see these next few years. And I did a podcast that's not out yet, a lady called Maleh, on AI. And interestingly, she feels there will be AI, they call it AI agents, but you might well be reporting to an AI leader. You might be, your co-workers might be AI artificial. So I think all of these things are going to be fascinating. Also, if you're able to take your research, put it into a model, and interview someone and find out what their early childhood experiences are, and then decide what type of leader they're going to be, I think that could be also very scary, interesting. But whatever. I mean, that's kind of what we do. So when we assess someone, we go. I mean, I go right the way back to day one, right? So what did your parents do? It is one of the first questions I ask. How many siblings you have? What was it like? What were meal times like in your family? It's interesting. So just to stop you there, it's interesting because if it's in an interview scenario, many people get a little offended, don't they? Or like they withdraw a little from the personal questions. I find it's quite interesting. I had a lady years ago, I remember, got sent. They were going through a big psychometric kind of assessment, and the pre-questionnaire was, I remember the questions were, did your parents get divorced? How did your dad treat you? Things like that. And she at first thought, hold on a sec, what's this got to do with my job? Oh my God, I'm pulling out the interview process. So it's interesting. I think it absolutely clearly a big predictor of leadership traits and stuff. So I think it depends upon the context of the interview. I mean, I'm quite lucky because I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist, so people kind of expect it, right? They come to me, and it's like, if I'm assessing them, most of the assessment I do is for CEOs and C-suite, and they kind of expect it. But even when people withdraw, and you're right, some people are defensive, some people just don't want to go there, but there's data in that. Yeah. There is data in that. Apologies. Absolutely. Very interesting.
I would also say that it all depends on the positioning of this, right? I mean, on how you establish rapport at the beginning of the discussion. I see that with our leadership development program. I mean, I've been running one of IMD's most senior executive development programs for CEOs and one level below CEOs. And I always started with some case studies. I mean, it's like giving them examples of other leaders that are in the public domain. And then gradually we go into them and into their life and into their own history. And if I did that on day one, they probably would have been terrified by the invasion into their personal space. But then on day 3, they just can't have enough of it. I mean, and they just keep going there. I mean, and then they go home. I mean, they bond together, and I see them on WhatsApp groups saying this is the most safe environment I've ever had to actually reflect on my life, to bond with other people, to realize I'm not alone, to recognize my sort of like baggage that I carry with me. So I would say it all has to do with the positioning, with how.
I mean, when I assess people, I've got a 4-hour interview with them, right? But I think what Shlomo's touched on there is that and you need to fill 4 hours. That's a long time. But what Shlomo's speaking to is that people want to tell their story too.
Yes.
I think you're right. There is a privacy there, but even within that, people, and I find people have had the most horrendous backgrounds, but in terms of incredibly difficult. But then the story is, how did they get through it? What did that do to them? What has it enabled in them? What did it grow? How did they? I met a gentleman the other week who grew up literally in a war zone, and boy, that does something to you. But his and it really at a simple level, right? He's very independent. He's very self-sufficient. He always steps in. He doesn't wait for solutions to come to him. If something's gone wrong, he gets very practical, solves it. And you can see that comes from his stories of when something's happened, a bomb's dropped, something has to be dealt with. and awful. What most people would look at and go, that's a very difficult childhood, and it has left some very difficult emotional scars in him.
Yeah,
but the effect has been has been rounded, and in many ways it's also the source of his success.
Yeah, but look at humans. I mean, we love telling stories. We've been telling stories forever. We pass knowledge on through storytelling, and it also does connect us well. I mean, yeah, when we first met, we shared stories, and bond gets, so it can actually happen very quickly, right? Just there's something that sparks a conversation, and you start sharing stories. But then when someone shares a story, you share your story. It's a really lovely way to build a relationship, to make friends with people, and all of that as well.
And to establish trust. And to establish trust. Yeah. I mean, our previous book was actually Leadership Operating System, in which we're looking at how a leader goes about creating an operating system that drives performance. And what came out in the results is that the number one element, the highest ranking element, I mean, in the factor analysis that we conducted, that determines whether you drive performance or not, is trust. And if you're not going to do some of that, trust is going to be eroded or never being built.
Yeah, love that. Guys, thank you so much. Great chat. Great chat. Appreciate it. Where can people find your book?
They can find it
I think everywhere.
Online bookstores, online, offline.
Can I say it makes a great present for children, grandparents, next door neighbors, people you randomly meet in the street.
There we go.
Yeah,
it'll be the best gift you ever give. I love that. Thank you so much for joining. I guess both of you on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with them both on LinkedIn. And have a great one. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.